Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Empowering Musicians podcast. I'm your host, Michael Manley, and today I was going to look back at this first kind of year-end wrap-up of my podcast and reflect on where I've been and where I'm going. And it's hard to believe that I have I think this might be the 32nd or 33rd episode of a project that I just started, not really knowing where it was going to head. And I thought this being December, it would be a good time to kind of reflect on what I've learned and where I've been through this podcast. And I am going to probably take a couple weeks off to focus on some other projects during the holidays, doing a lot of traveling. So this will be my last episode of the year, but I'm looking forward to having some exciting guests as we start the new year in 2023. And I thought I would start by just going into why I decided to do this podcast. And at first, I was really thinking about my journey, which was not the journey I had planned on. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later. But the way we prepare as artists, especially as musicians in our careers, is quite focused, and it's quite laser focused and narrow, I would say. And that was something that as a musician, I was incredibly driven to achieve. And of course, my journey did not end up on the path that I thought it would. And I wanted to kind of tell that story in my first episode. And that turned out to be the reason why I wanted to do a podcast, was to start getting used to telling my story and sharing my story. And that first episode was, of course, kind of terrifying because I decided to do these live. The live component comes from a couple different things. One is that it's much more spontaneous. It's much more, I think, rich. And there's also a chance for folks to interact and add comments if they feel so inclined to chime in. And so it's a much more interactive way. And it's a much less predictable way to do a podcast. It also means that there's a certain amount of vulnerability there. And so in my first episode, I really wanted to share my story and my journey because telling our stories is something that takes a lot of courage because we actually are showing our vulnerability, and that's uncomfortable and terrifying, right? So I wanted to do that in my first episode, which turned out to be, of course, scary because it was the first episode, and also I was telling my story. So, but that episode turned out to be one of, I think, the most popular and the one that I've gotten the most comments on. After that episode, it was a little bit easier, and I got more comfortable, especially with bringing guests on and having just great conversations. And I think what's been fascinating is that some of those conversations are not where I thought they would go, but I think they ended up being better than what I planned. So sometimes that kind of unpredictability and spontaneity leads to a different outcome that is better than the one we thought. Again, for artists, this is exactly the opposite of how we train, right? We're not trained to be vulnerable. We're not trained to show any kind of, vulnerability or unpredictability, right? When we're on stage, we've planned and we've prepared to deliver something that is close to perfection and is close to, as farthest away from unpredictable, right, as we can get, as far as wanting to be technically perfect. So that idea of being much more in the realm of jazz than in the realm of classical in terms of preparation was something that was really uncomfortable for me at first with this podcast. And it's something that I wanted to get over. I really wanted to get over that kind of fear of that. So my own journey was something that I wanted to share. And I shared, again, in my first episode, the kind of roots of that journey, right? And it was one of adaptation, pivoting, having to switch gears and switch lanes, in some ways thriving against all odds, and moving in and out of performance as my main income. So I've had periods of my life where I've made 100% of my income playing my instrument, which is the French horn. I've had other times when I haven't played the French horn for any of my income in that year. And that's, I think, the opposite of what I thought I would have, right? And the career that I prepared for. And what struck me was that actually I'm not unique, right? Like most of us have the kind of career that I've had as artists, especially in the case of something as focused and niche as like being an instrumentalist, whether it's a classical musician, a theater musician, a jazz musician, and world musician, whatever it is that you're choosing. That preparation is almost entirely focused on excellence and on mastering our instruments and our skills. And we expect that we're going to take that, and in the case of classical musicians, that we're going to secure some sort of full-time employment with a flagship arts institution, playing violin in the Chicago Symphony or trumpet in the Cleveland Orchestra, singing on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera, or playing keyboards in the pit of Wicked or Lion King, right? But the fact is that very few people who graduate from conservatories and colleges of music actually have those careers because the opportunities are quite limited. And so it occurred to me, I had this kind of revelation that it seems to me like the preparation and the roadmap that is being taught in the college and conservatory system is geared toward the few people who are going to secure those few opportunities, but that the mass of other artists and other musicians and really performing artists as a whole are not getting any preparation for that career that looks like what the majority of careers look like. So what does the roadmap for the kind of career I had look like? Well, as far as I know, there really isn't one. And, my career was much more, again, eclectic, unpredictable, and varied than that career that I thought I would have, which was some sort of stable, secure employment with an arts institution that is itself a flagship and is never going anywhere, right? So I began this podcast as an exploration of that alternative roadmap, to look at basically what is everything else that we might want to learn or know about as performing artists that doesn't involve the practice room or the stage. So this podcast, in a lot of ways, is a kind of exploration of what that alternative curriculum or roadmap might look like. And so in some ways, it's been this kind of ball of clay that I'm in my head kind of thinking through all these different episodes and all these different interviews, like what is it that I'm learning from all these great guests that I've had that I can take and make into perhaps a curriculum? What would a curriculum for a more real career and a more typical career look like? Again, I think conservatories, music schools, they're doing great work and they're providing amazing educations. And they're very focused on preparation and performance, right? And that's what you need as an artist. You need those opportunities, absolutely. But we also need to think about if the opportunities at those flagship institutions are very, very limited, or if those opportunities even go away, right? So over the pandemic, I think the most high-profile institution, I'll say, that was particularly not good to its artists, I'll say it, was the Metropolitan Opera, right? So they chose on the pandemic to say, you know what, we're going to focus on X, Y, and Z. We feel like that the government is providing enough of a parachute through pandemic relief, pandemic unemployment insurance and other things, that we're just going to leave all of our artists behind. And it was a shock to a lot of us, especially those of us that work in the labor field, because we thought, well, the Metropolitan Opera has, more resources than anyone else. They also are the most expensive in terms of production, right? It costs a lot of money to produce opera. And, leaving aside the emotion, it was a decision that the management made. And there was, they left their artists kind of behind in the pandemic. A lot of institutions, ironically, which were much more smaller, didn't do that. And they were able to offer partial employment or streaming opportunities and doing online concerts and very creative ways to look at that. But the thing that was so striking was that the Metropolitan Opera is, I think, like playing for the New York Yankees, right? Like if you're a baseball player, you can't go any higher than that. And so if that job isn't secure, which temporarily it wasn't, right? Then what are we doing, right? So even for those folks that do secure those opportunities with these flagship arts institutions, I think we're seeing some cracks in the system, right? We're seeing that even an institution as storied and stable and as high profile as the Metropolitan Opera can have moments. At least now it's been moments, right? It could be other things later of instability and insecurity. So thinking about if these jobs that we are working so diligently to audition for are not even that, if they're not the most stable jobs in the world, and if it's unlikely, or if we find that we don't secure one of those jobs, what does our career have to look like, right? Like, what does our career in our chosen field look like? So I've tried to bring on some really cool guests in this first season of my podcast, right? And I had some great friends and colleagues and people from inside and outside of music. And I'm just thinking back on some of these folks. I've had some, my friend Jared Tate, if you haven't seen that episode, I think it was maybe the second episode I did. It's just amazing interview. And Jared is a very talented pianist, and that's how I knew him, right? I was working in the world of theater, and we connected through that. And then I realized he was this amazing composer when I randomly ran into him later in my life. And, he had some really great advice, I thought, which was to just be that, right? Like, he is a Chickasaw classical composer, right? And we had a conversation about the fact that that was a lane that he just carved that path for himself. And he didn't ever question the fact that his music was, was culturally Indian or culturally Western, or he didn't deal with that at all. He just does what he does. And I thought that was such a powerful message of just show up and be what you want to be. It seems really obvious and simple, but yet it's profound. And so I learned a lot from all these guests. And, I've had a lot of orchestra managers on, arts managers, arts consultants, and it was fascinating to talk to them about their journeys and what they're focused on in terms of making sure that from that end of the field that we do have these opportunities for musicians and artists. And I think that there is this naturally adversarial relationship between artists and management, right? And it's never going to go away. But it doesn't mean that we have to be enemies, as we always say. You can have really healthy, productive, collaborative relationships with arts managers and artists, right? Labor and management, as it were. And I think the best of those folks who serve in that in that way and who are successful at it in building arts organizations are people who are former artists. And so one of the things that I was really focused on with this idea of what a curriculum might look like is artists having the understanding and permission in a way to look at those as alternative careers to performance. And I think we've seen some amazing people that transition away, some for reasons that are forced, like they've had injuries or they have illnesses or something that prevents them from being an artist. I also know other arts managers who just got tired or they just felt like they'd reached the end of what they wanted to accomplish as performers and then went into arts management. And they bring the same amount of creativity, they bring the same amount of passion to that, and they find that it's just as rewarding to them. So arts management is one of the careers that I think we don't talk about early enough in the training of musicians and other performing artists. So I was really glad to have on my friend Russell Jones, my friend Meg Sippy, and some of these folks who are just John McCann, who just live in this world all the time. And it's a challenge because one of the things that I've learned also in doing some of this work myself with a small organization here locally is that, it seems like there's infinite resource. And I really believe there is. There's infinite resource in the world. But getting people to care about your organization and donate to it is a really specific art form in itself. And a lot of these managers who are, I think, the best in the business are those who say to themselves, how do we build this organization, right? How do we grow this organization? How do we find ways to grow artistically and not just give in to the fact that, well, we're only going to be this size and therefore we can only live in this realm. And that's rare, and it's a skill, again, that I think very few have. So I'm really glad that I was able to have my friend Meg Sippy, Russell Jones, if you can see those episodes, if you're at all interested in a career in the field of arts management, there too to really check out. And I also wanted to work with folks that are completely outside of this field, right? So I had a really like almost an hour-long episode a few weeks ago with my friend Eric Gladstone, and that was really interesting because he works now with chefs and restaurants, and that's a way that I connected with him because we're both foodies and we live in an amazing food city, which is Las Vegas. And but he spent his early career as a music journalist, covering alternative and indie bands in the 90s in America. And he sort of saw up close that transition from the sort of old school hardware to a completely digital model, right? Which is something that we're all still dealing with in the arts. And looking at how those bands back then were being affected by the fact that everything was going to streaming versus traditional record sales, and what the different what the similarities are between that kind of passion for cooking and the passion for music. So I've really tried to explore a lot of different connections in this podcast and with my guests, and I'm really happy that I'm closing the year out with now 33 episodes, I want to say, and everything from my friend Valerie, who is a theater musician. If you're at all interested in theater music, please check out her episode. We did a really great episode with Stephen Kaplan here in Las Vegas, who is a professor of oboe at UNLV, who's also a body mapping expert, and talking about body use and carriage and how all of that affects our playing. And I've done a lot of solo episodes, which are always more challenging because it's always fun to just talk to somebody and have a conversation. But one of the ones that I've done, I think that was really resonating with folks was on, what a Bill of Rights might look like for musicians, and what we can expect. And what I found in my career is that those things which seem obvious to me are not obvious to other people. For example, if somebody is recording you while you're performing, what's going to happen to that recording? And you have a right, it might be being violated, but you do have a right to your recorded material, right? And that we should expect certain things when we're on jobs and question them if we're not getting those things. So that's been a really good episode. I think I've had a lot of comments on that. And I also talk a lot about the scarcity mindset, which is something that it's like an undercurrent of a lot of my work on this podcast, because again, I think that if we have this mindset through our education that I'm this one thing, I'm going to be the principal clarinet of the Boston Symphony. That's my goal. And if I can't be that, I want to be the principal clarinet of the Chicago Symphony, right? If you have that kind of focus and you have that kind of drive, you have to be careful that you're not going to want to do that at all costs, right? So this idea that, well, if I don't achieve that, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what my backup plan is. This is the only thing that gives me joy in the world. And if I can't do this, I don't know what's going to happen, right? If you're coming from that place, it's very hard to do what you do in a way that respects your worth. I think it can be, right? So we have to be careful that we don't get so wrapped up in our identity with what we do that we'll do it at all costs, right? And so we talked a lot about this a couple weeks ago with the idea that, oh, well, if I'm not going to do it for this, somebody else will do it for less. And if I ask for more, they might cut the music. There are all these kind of loops that we play in our head that all stem from the fact that we are so wrapped up in this one thing. But if we have a self-identity that is much broader than just that one thing, then we can say, you know what, maybe I'm not going to take that job because it doesn't actually pay me what I should be paid. Or I have a choice here. Like, I'm not just this person. So there is a sort of like a drop of toxicity, I would say, in that kind of education, which we still perpetuate to this day, right? We have these conservatories that are very prestigious, and we have this kind of pedestal that we put ourselves up on and that others put us on from an early age. We stopped using it, I think, finally, but for a while we were all gifted and we were going to these prestigious institutions, and it subtly sets up an expectation that, well, gosh, if I'm not that person on that pedestal who is the great violin player or the great singer, then what am I, right? And so that kind of pedestal mindset, that kind of being held up as that special kind of gifted elite performer actually does lead to this scarcity mindset. And I really wanted to explore what those connections were. And for me, if you listen to my first episode, you'll know that I was kind of cured of that pretty quickly because I had a terrible injury and I was not sure I would ever play again. And I had to wake up from the fact that, gosh, maybe I'm more than this, or maybe I have to be something different than this. And that was a real wake-up call for me. So when I think about this podcast and what my aims were, I thought to myself, we have a lot of education that's about really creating excellence, but excellent artists is only half of the battle, right? We also have to empower artists, and we have to empower ourselves as musicians and artists. And so I came upon this idea of what does empowerment look like versus what does excellence look like? And I just want to pause to say thanks to John McCann, who's given me a great comment here. He says, kudos for fostering a rich set of discussions about artists, how we can respect and enable their value to our human community and experience. Thank you, John. You were a great guest, and I hope to have you back because I feel like we just scratched the surface of that. And, John, I'm remembering on his episode, we talked about this study that just blew my mind, and it was very bracing, and it was around the fact that artists were perceived as like very kind of like not valuable, right? In terms of like, a poll of average folks, doing a poll would put artists somewhere around, really, really far below teachers or doctors as people who are adding value to society. And so that was a great education for me and a lesson. And I really want to look deeper into that. And I think when I started reading a study, and I think it came out in 2002, so it was a few years old, but I thought one of the problems of that study was the problem with the word artist, right? And we've talked about this also a lot on this podcast about that loaded term, right? What does it mean to be an artist? And I think that's why in my recommendations, when I talk to people in the field that I work in, which is musicians, professional musicians, I try to avoid the word artist. I try to avoid the word even professional, because that has connotations which may or may not have to do with making money. And I use the term working, right? So I was wondering after that conversation with John on another podcast, like what would the response to that study have been if instead of asking about artists, they asked about working singers or working musicians or working painters, right? Like, because I do think that it creates a huge difference in the mind of our peers here on planet Earth when we don't call ourselves artists, we call ourselves working blank. It's small, but it's profound actually when you think about it, because I think that nobody can relate to an artist. If I were to go up to somebody at Starbucks in line and they asked me what I did, and I said, "Oh, I'm an artist," right? They're going to be like, "I don't know what that means. Does that mean that you paint? Does it mean that you dance? Does it mean that you write books? Does it mean they don't?" There's no concept, right? But if I say, "Oh, you know what? I'm a working musician," they're going to be like, "Oh, what do you play?" It's going to start a conversation. So I wanted to, one of the things I do want to ask John about when I have him on again is that idea of whether he thinks that's true about artists and that concept. Because I do think that is a charged and problematic term when we think about what we do. So I wanted to just close by saying that two things. One is that I did hit on this idea that like the biggest contribution I can make is not in musical excellence, right? I think there's a lot of pedagogy and study and opportunities for people that want to be musically excellent. I do have an interest as a teacher in beginning, returning, and recovering French horn players. That's a very, very small niche. And that's the focus that I do with my musical teaching. However, I think in terms of careers and in terms of musical contribution I can make, it's not going to be somebody taking a lesson for me because they want to audition for the Chicago Symphony, right? They're not going to come to me for that. But what can I offer? And I think it really all comes down to this idea, again, that excellence is not enough and that we need to be empowered. And so that's how this whole podcast, Empowering Musicians podcast, came about. I came upon that title because I thought it was really the most accurate in terms of what I was trying to do and what I hope to do in serving the world. And I'll say that we never know what the impact is. I don't, the way the podcast is delivered, I don't often have a very strong sense of how many people are watching or whether they're watching on YouTube or LinkedIn or Facebook. But I do sometimes get a glimpse of some impact that I'm making, which is really, really rewarding. And The other day, somebody tagged me in a comment on Facebook in a group because there was a horn player in Lisbon, Portugal, who had recovered from a broken jaw, and they're like, "Oh, you need to connect with Michael Manley and listen to his podcast because he did a whole episode on that, right?" And so I'm really grateful for the fact that I get these interesting connections, and I ended up having a really great meeting with that horn player, and we talked about what we both did to recover from that. And so it's really been an amazing journey so far. We don't really know what our impact is. All I know is that I'm just hoping to put this out there and hope that others see it, because I truly believe, again, that excellence is going to take us so far, and we really need to move along with that to a place of empowerment. And I hope that you've enjoyed this podcast, and I will look forward to more guests, more conversations, and more insights in 2023 when I return with Empowering Musicians Podcast. Have a great rest of 2022 and happy holidays to everybody, and we'll see you in the new year.